Great. Thank you so much, Vicki. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Warden, and I am the Extended Campus and Distance Services Librarian at Florida State University Libraries.
And hello to everyone. I am Emily Mann. I'm the Research and Information Services Librarian at Florida State Universities.
And today we're going to be talking about how to improve your chat reference with emotional intelligence. So to provide a bit of an outline for what we're going to be talking about today, I want to start out and talk about at Florida State University, our statistics and our experience and the background of where we're coming from and why we decided emotional intelligence was an important aspect of our chat reference and how we started a training program. We're going to start off with some basics to remember in virtual reference because really you can't get into more in-depth reference support unless you're really taking care of the basics in your chat interactions. Emily will then go through the introduction to emotional intelligence and how emotional intelligence can be used in virtual reference. We have some fun interactive emotional intelligence exercises, and then we'll kind of wind down to rethink best practices, how can we continually improve our chat, and how to implement a training program at your own organization. And finally, we'll have a final discussion and conclusion, and there will be time for questions at the end. So Emily and I co-coordinate the virtual reference service at Florida State Ask a Librarian. And our service is pretty unique because we staff it all hours that our main library is open, which is 24 hours, 5 days a week during the academic year with shortened hours during our breaks and during the summer. But we have very long hours where we always have an FSU librarian, a staff, or a graduate assistant staffing the service. And we have over 40 people that staff our service and participate in the FSU Ask a Librarian. So it is a lot to coordinate and to make sure that we're all being held up to the same standard of service. Emily and I took over coordinating the service in 2014, and I was coming in really focusing on distance populations and our growing online populations and just the growing needs of our users and what they need from a reference interaction today, which is a lot different than maybe just having a consultation and a set up physical meeting. We also provide specialized chat desks, virtual reference desks for interlibrary loan and material delivery service. So we do have some specialized chat services, but the rest of our largely staff service is just general questions where we encourage people to come in for quick questions or even to have longer interactions. So this is a comparison between our chats from fall 2015 to fall 2016 during the academic year. And as you can see, we had a huge increase in fall 2016. We went from 1,126 chats in our fall semester 2015 to 1,928 chats during our fall semester 2016. This is a 71 increase, so we saw a huge increase in chat interactions. This was partly due to having better placement on our website. Also, we have been marketing the service. I've done a lot trying to get it in our extended campuses, our distance populations, but also marketing it even on campus as well. Whenever we do a training, whether it's internally or externally, I think it's really important to go over the basics to remember. These are always going to be the basics of any successful reference interaction. And in chat, there's certain things that we all know you need to do, and it's going to make your chat polite and have just a good process you go through. So the first thing is really a greeting and a follow-up, making sure you're always greeting the patron by name, introducing yourself, which is something that you're provided in the CAN chats, and then following up to make sure you're properly answering the question, fully answering the reference. Because in a lot of times when you are in a chat interaction, you can't tell what that person is feeling right off the bat, so you need to ask a lot of questions to make sure you are giving them the information they need. We often tell our staff to think of each interaction as a reference interview. So yes, sometimes this is going to be a 1-minute reference interview, but nonetheless, it is a reference interview and we should keep all those steps in mind. There are basic principles of customer service that can be applied to librarianship, and those should be applied in our chat service as well. Tone is something that is really important in chat. One word can really set off where you sound like you're being rude, even if you're not trying to. We talk about this all the time in etiquette with email, online, so always thinking about your tone and your words very carefully. And giving your full attention. One thing that I've noticed with virtual reference, a lot of times people will be sort of monitoring the desk but working on something else. Where if you were giving an in-person reference interview, you would never be working on something else. And so it's important to give virtual reference your full attention the same way you would give that attention to somebody in person. So one thing we're going to do throughout this presentation is have some interaction and some discussion, and we really hope that you will take part in the discussion by using the chat box. And our first discussion question, just to get you thinking about your chat reference skills, is do you think you can improve your virtual reference skills, and how are some ways that you think you could improve your virtual reference skills? So please use the chat box and give us some of your thoughts.
And while people are starting to chat or starting to type, this is Emily coming in, and I just want to say, I've been doing virtual reference since, I guess, 2011, and I still find ways that I can improve on it every day. So I think for me, I'm always looking for ways that I can improve. Do more of it is what one of our panelists said, and yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Practice, get more experience. Mm-hmm.
I agree, because sometimes one of the ways you can get better and better virtual reference is just continuing to do it and always finding new ways, new avenues, and new sources to send your patrons.
And someone else said reviewing your own chats from the past. I think that's a really great way to improve yourself because you want to review, you want to do self-assessment, see how you are doing, and see how you can move forward.
We always encourage people staffing our service to take time to read through your own chats and read through others' chats. I mean, the chats are open for anyone to read, and you can really learn a lot looking, especially from people who are veterans doing chat reference, for new people to have that sort of model, which was just brought up. And I agree. I learned something when I read really great chats and something that I could do better. All right, great. We're going to move on to Emily talking about the reference interview.
Okay, so I am the reference librarian here at FSU, so I can't let you guys get away without me talking to you a little bit about the reference interview. I think it's so important because people sometimes forget that there's a lot of aspects to virtual reference, but I think the most basic part is to do the reference interview. And especially it can be hard when you're doing it through online chat because often people just start out with a question rather than coming up to you. You don't get to read that body language. They just come up straight with a question. Sometimes they see that box and they just enter their research question because they think it's another search box on the library homepage. They aren't even aware it's going to connect them to a person. So it's really important to think about the reference interview. This is my own version of the reference interview that I like to kind of point people towards. And welcoming is being really large, and I think that should kind of encompass everything. And so being welcoming from the beginning and then keeping that welcoming feeling within yourself. And again, right now I'm just talking about the reference interview, and we'll talk about how we can connect that with emotional intelligence and virtual reference a little bit later. So your first step is to gather information, figure out what the real question is. We all know after working through virtual reference that a lot of times the original question is not what they actually need. Confirm the exact question, figure out what they're really asking. You've gotten some information from them, but you want to make sure you're really answering the question. Give the answer as best you can, and then follow up. And I have it as a circle because a lot of times you'll follow up and you'll find out, oh, you thought you knew what they wanted, you gave the answer, they're nodding along, and then you follow up and you say, is there anything else I can help you with? And they go, well, actually, I kind of needed this. So just remembering that it's not like a straight linear process. It's something that kind of you're going to continue doing. And then, of course, we have RUSA guidelines for a successful reference interview. And we'll get back to these as well with emotional intelligence. But those are going to include approachability. So, again, that welcoming, showing interest, listening and inquiry, searching, and follow up. So, again, very similar to the reference interview that I was showing you before. But these are just really kind of the check marks that need to go within it. So, emotional intelligence. I'd like to kind of just hear from you guys. Has anyone sort of heard about emotional intelligence, read about it, anything? Sure. And I'd like to get people's read on emotional intelligence because I know the first time I sort of heard emotional intelligence, I thought, oh, that's pop psychology. That doesn't really apply. Does anyone else have that feeling? Or maybe you guys all love it. Yes. Okay, excellent. Knowing how to read people's intentions by the use of their words, yeah, and their body language. But yeah, I think emotional intelligence is really interesting, and I'll get to this on a later slide, but it became very popular in pop culture before it was really taken on by the academic community. It's a relatively new concept. It's a model used to explain individual differences in people's ability to use emotion-related information to enhance thinking and problem solving. And it's about using that emotion with logic, not using them one versus the other. And that's why we have this picture of Spock right here, because of course he's the logic, but his emotions get the best of him. So he's actually a perfect example of using emotional intelligence, because despite him saying that wouldn't be logical, he does really use the emotion within his feelings as well. So yeah, with emotional intelligence, it's about taking the concept of logic versus emotion to thinking the logic of emotion. How can we use the logic of emotion to assess a situation? There's several models. The first one, and the one we're going to talk about, is the ability model. It's the original model by Marin's Salovey. And there's also mixed models, which include personality traits, like optimism, being calm, being flexible. Personally, I'm not like the mixed models are interesting, but we're not going to talk about them as much today because if it's a personality trait, sometimes it's harder to train someone in or to improve yourself in. But the ability model is really about abilities that you can measure in yourself and then see if you can improve within yourself. As I said, it was really very widely accepted by pop psychology due to this best-selling book by Daniel Goleman that you guys have probably seen before. This came out in 1990, and it was hugely popular, and you kind of heard about emotional intelligence in, like, talk shows and things like that. And it's a relatively new concept in general. It came out in the 90s, which, isn't that long ago, and it's being worked on still. And so because it was so popular because of this emotional intelligence book, people kind of might have boxed it in as something that was a little bit pop psychology and doesn't have any academic thought behind it. But it really does. And they're doing more and more studies with it because it's just a repackaging a little bit of how we already thought about it. Because our mood and our emotions are obviously going to affect our cognitive abilities. So this is the ability model, and so these are the different abilities under tools. The ability is to perceive emotion, and then the skills with that would be your ability with that would be to identify and distinguish and express emotions. And that's both within yourself, that's a self um, perceiving within yourself and perceiving within others. Then using emotion, ability to generate emotion in yourself and in others, which can result in different cognitive states. I think if you think about it, if you come to work and you're really stressed out, it can be hard to concentrate and get your work done. And if you're in a good emotional place, sometimes it just feels like it's flowing and it's working really well. And so using emotion, thinking if you have the ability to realize what your emotions are and how to generate those emotions, you can help yourself get into a better cognitive state. And then, of course, if we can do that for our patrons, we can help them to get into a better cognitive state. Because I think we all recognize a lot of times when they're coming to us through virtual reference, they're coming to us in a state of emotional distress. Understanding emotions, so the knowledge of emotions as well as the ability to predict how your own emotional state will evolve as the situation changes. And again, the ability to predict how others' emotional states might evolve. So understanding emotion and then managing emotion, the ability to regulate your own emotion and others' emotions. And this isn't supposed to be, you know, ordering people around and be like, you must feel happy and you must feel sad, but just the ability to kind of help them get into a better emotional state so that they can get to a better cognitive process. And so these are some questions about emotional intelligence, and these are questions within academia. Do the abilities just describe personality traits? So are they really abilities if they're just personality traits, if that's just who you are? How can you measure an ability? They do have a measurable test that they've created, but again, it's going to be very qualitative, not quantitative. So it is hard to measure an ability. Can emotional intelligence be taught? Are people just born emotionally intelligent and that's just how it is? And then again, the ability versus personality trait. And even within people who study and talk about emotional intelligence, there's kind of a disagreement right there. And then, can these abilities be used in a virtual setting? Everything that I've read so far about emotional intelligence, it tends to talk about reading body language a lot of the times, and we're not getting that body language when we're within virtual reference. So how can we connect emotions to words?
So we have another discussion question, and maybe that you've been thinking about emotional intelligence. Hopefully you're thinking about yourself and your own emotional intelligence. And so in the chat box, will you tell us how do you feel that you have a high or a low EQ? And do you think this is something that you can learn?
And we saw that someone said you can figure out emotions sometimes through emojis, and I totally agree with that statement. I think emojis are a godsend within virtual reference because if someone is not sending you smiley faces and they're saying things and they seem kind of upset, then there's a good chance they actually are upset, you know? That's why I love exclamation points. Okay, so one person says, I think my EQ is average, definitely room for improvement, hoping I can learn. Another person says they feel like they have high emotional intelligence and definitely can learn from experiences and examples. Excellent. Somewhat in the middle. I do think it can be improved. That's excellent. I love that y'all think it can be improved. And I think it can. I think when I think about my own emotional intelligence, I would say naturally I have a kind of lower emotional intelligence. And Lindsay, how do you feel about your EQ?
I feel that I have a pretty high EQ. As we've been working on kind of our research and talking about it, I really think that it's something that I feel is somewhat ingrained on me, but I definitely agree that it's something you can learn and be trained in and grow in as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I've been doing this research, again, I don't feel like I have a super high EQ, but these are things that I can then think about. So I stop myself and I say, okay, so let's think about the emotions you're feeling right now. and let's see what we can do with them. And let's actually control our own emotions instead of them controlling us. And let's get to a better cognitive space. And even if we just, again, if we think about them logically, it helps us. It's using emotions to make logic work.
So really we want to talk about how can you better engage your users, your customers through emotional intelligence. And what I really want to argue, and we've argued in this training, is how our users feel during a reference interaction is really going to determine how they feel about the whole library. They can feel, happy about the space and the resources and the collection, but if they have a bad interaction with a librarian or library staff, they may really feel negatively towards the entire library. So another point is to really empathize with the emotion, but don't try to analyze it. And I think Emily talked about this a little bit in the introduction to emotional intelligence, because you want to try and recognize the emotion, try and understand it, but we don't need to play psychologists or psychiatrists. That would take way too much of our time. And so it's really about understanding it and trying to figure out how you can act to create a better interaction. And EQ really requires self-awareness and self-care. And I actually think that the self-assessment part of sort of virtual reference is really important, because you're thinking about how am I talking, how am I acting, how am I doing. But if you're stressed out, if you are having a bad day, if you're feeling like you're, been taking some abuse from patrons, or you just had a bad day, it's really important that you give yourself the self-care you need to also be emotionally intelligent and allow yourself to maintain that sort of level of calm and positivity.
And I
And
want to I want to break in there just to say, just the other day I was doing virtual reference and I was in a really good headspace, and then I suddenly had 5 chats going at once and my stress level went up. And I had to be aware of where I was, because the patron who I was talking to at any given time, they didn't know all of that stuff was going on, and it wasn't to them. They weren't, asking a lot of questions that I needed to get through. They were just looking for help. So it was really important for me to be self-aware and to really take that time to bring my own emotions down so that I could be answering them in the best way possible.
definitely, I agree with that. Always thinking about that we don't know what our patrons are going through at the end of our chat, and they also don't know what we're going through at this time, but always trying to remember that we are the information professionals, and that's part of the reference service that we're offering. So emotions alter our cognitive process, and when we're aware of our emotions and those around us, we increase our cognitive skills. And I think Emily's anecdote was really perfect to show that, to demonstrate that happens to us all the time. When we're feeling emotional, we're going to think differently, and that's going to happen to our patrons as well. Some studies indicate that cognitive processes can modify our mood or emotion, and so it works the other way as well.
I thought that was so interesting. And when I thought about it, you're like, oh, that does make sense. But there have been studies that really show that they literally put a person in a bad mood. They try and get them in a feeling stressed or unhappy, and then they give them a task to do, and some of that stress and unhappiness can kind of melt away, and they can move to a more positive emotion, which is pretty awesome.
So, what are some of the advantages of using emotional intelligence? It's going to promote creativity and flexible thinking, because it's going to improve your cognitive processes and just really get you thinking in different ways. It will help you understand complex questions. In chat, sometimes you can get a crazy question that is very hard to understand, especially without talking to that person in, the physical life. Trying to understand in a virtual environment can be even more difficult. But when you have the emotional intelligence and trying to think of that backdrop to the reference question, it's always going to aid you. When people are involved, emotions are involved. The advantage of using emotional intelligence is that Emotions are always going to be involved in our reference interactions. They're going to be involved in all of our interactions. That's just the way it is. And using EQ and virtual reference means a better experience for both patrons and practitioners. So it's going to just create not just a better experience for our patrons, but for us as well. And being self-aware of emotions will help you be aware of how you might be perceived. So it's not only reading our patrons and trying to create a better experience for them, but it's helping us think about, if we're having a bad day or if something is going on in our head, how that will affect our patrons. And really, this is all about communicating more fully and better and having more engaging and more meaningful interactions.
All right, so we're going to have a little more discussion because, again, we think it's fun. So what emotions do you assume that your patrons are feeling? What are some emotions you guys kind of sense from your patrons? And how? How are you sensing that? Frustration, great. How are you sensing frustration? I see a lot of people saying frustration.
That's a big one, though. I know that's what we see on our chat service. And yep, impatience. That's another great one.
And that's confusion because they're asking a question, yeah. And the thing about frustration and impatience are those are going to put you in a place where you might not be ready for the cognitive load of actually learning to do something. They say they've looked at all the websites and can't find the information they need. Yeah, they come at you and you say, which resource have you looked for? And they say they've looked at everything. And yes, usually they're coming to chat after they've exhausted their resources. So they've spent a lot of time and energy already, and they're feeling frustrated. So it's really important to think about that. And even if we've had that same question 5 times, it's their first time they're asking it. And so it's so important that you treat that as it's important. It's important that you understand where their emotions are at this point. And it's important that you, have empathy. Empathy, someone put in empathy and rephrasing their questions lets you understand what they're saying. And yeah, sometimes it's just as easy as saying, I'm really sorry, that must be really frustrating for you. Let me see if I can help you. Putting it on yourself sometimes. So how can you address these emotions in a positive manner through virtual reference? Empathy is a great one. And rephrasing, that's like an actual thing you can do is rephrase their question, show them that you're listening. Again, it's relating back to that reference interview. Avoiding blame, yeah, not saying, how did you not know that?
Hmm.
All right. So this next one, I would like help from you guys. I've put out the RUSA guidelines, approachability, interest, listening and inquiry, searching, and follow-up, and then the emotional abilities that I just talked about. And I would like to see if you guys see a connection between them. I started trying to actually map them, and they all kind of map, so I'd like to hear your reasoning behind mapping. So approachability, what emotional ability goes with approachability? Understanding emotion, yeah, showing that you're empathetic and I think using emotion as well. I think that being friendly and having a friendly tone and manner. So using your emotions and managing emotions, trying to create an emotional safe space for approachability. So yeah, I think a lot of them perceiving as well, but that's once we talk to them. Excellent. So interest. What emotional ability is involved in showing interest?
I think interest really could be almost all of them if you really think about it.
Yeah.
Interest is, yeah, such an important part of connecting with a patron.
Yeah, and I think perceiving emotion, that's really where you are going to perceive that emotion and you're going to show interest. And again, that helps to manage emotion as well because sometimes when you're showing interest and you're saying, I am sorry that you had such a frustrating time looking for this resource, it can really help manage their emotions. They're going to go from frustrated to feeling understood, right? So their emotions might be changing just by you showing them interest. Okay, restate or listening and inquiry. I think this uses a lot of the same emotional abilities as interest does. Listening and inquiry is really managing emotion, using emotion. Searching, I don't know that searching uses emotion so much, but it is, you can use emotion and manage emotion by letting them know that you're searching, right? So thinking about the emotion just of you being gone, if you're searching and you're not letting them know, please hold while I take a look at that. Exactly. If you're not letting them know what's happening, their emotions might go back to that like stress level, right? Because they might think you're just giving them the silent treatment. I don't know if you guys text, but sometimes you send out a text and then you wait a long time to hear back from it, and you're like, why are they ignoring me? And all these emotional things are happening. It's the same with our virtual reference. So, thinking about the emotion behind that silence, so letting them know what's happening, and then follow up. Follow up, I think, relates to perceiving emotion again. Are you feeling okay? Did you get what you needed out of this? Using emotion, I'm really glad you came and talked to us. Let us know if we can help you anyway. So, do you guys think that the RUSA guidelines and the reference interview relate to emotional intelligence?
I
Yeah.
definitely do. Yeah.
All right. So we'll go to our next slide, which is more discussion. And this is me again. After thinking about emotional intelligence, and you guys, a lot of you said you'd sort of heard of emotional intelligence before, and virtual reference. Do you see a connection, and why or why not?
I think that in the virtual environment, because we're not face to face with a person, we almost have to be more receptive of the words and of what people are saying and um, the emojis, the punctuation, all these things really, really, transmit the emotion. And so I think that there is a connection, and I think it's almost can be more important in a virtual environment because you don't have that face-to-face contact.
Someone wrote in, you have to know how to see the underlying emotional tone of a written query. Exactly. Um, Trying to kind of read underlying emotional tones, that can be really hard. Someone else put in, I've had people type in all caps. That's very stressful. They're showing their emotion just through a typing thing. And that's just so interesting, isn't it? Because to us, all caps means an emotion. That's like a cultural cue that we're getting out of just typing. That's pretty cool. I'm looking at it all crazy now.
So now we're going to go through a series of statements, and we're going to ask how would you approach the following statements with emotional intelligence? So how would you respond if patrons said these things to you in a chat?
And also think about how you would perceive their emotions.
Why do you need to know if this is for a class? When we're teaching virtual reference, it's very useful to find out if this is for an assignment or for a certain class. But sometimes we have patrons that react in this way. If you ask, is this for a class? So what do you think, they're feeling when they're asking this?
To me, I see them feeling defensive.
Mhm.
So I would want to then approach it in a way that I'm making it clear that I'm not trying to say they're doing anything wrong. And so someone says, maybe you might not think that the question is worthy. Yeah, it comes across as you being like, well, is this really for a class because we don't answer anything else? Um, and then just explaining why. We ask so we know if you need academic references or general knowledge sources would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Exactly. So just explaining it, explaining your process so that they understand. And that's that logic that goes with the emotion, right? When we connect the logic, we say, here's why we're doing this. We're not just doing this because we're not just asking you because we think you've done a bad job or you failed at finding it yourself. It's so that we can then move to the next best step.
Are you single? I'm lonely. This is a virtual reference question that many people have probably gotten before or something of the
A
like.
variant of some sort, for sure.
How, what do you think this person is feeling?
And I think this is one of those things where we only see part of the conversation. So we might think they are feeling lonely, or we might think they're a troll. We don't know. Maybe they're just feeling like they want to annoy someone.
Maybe amused. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's what we talked about. We got a little bit of a lively discussion out of this before because, it could just be somebody who's trying to have some fun, or it could be someone who actually is lonely or depressed or sort of asking for help. And so for us, we talked about maybe if people say this, you should give them the contact information for the crisis center or for different support centers we have in the community or on campus.
But I agree. You do want to see if you can move it forward. And that's when you really want to think about your emotional intelligence. We've got some people who are saying, well, you could say, is there a reference question I can answer for you today? Um, but what kind of emotion does that send? So thinking about what your response is, even if you think they're coming at it from like a kind of jokey thing, treating it as if they are lonely. So being acknowledging that, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry you're feeling lonely. I'm actually just here to help you with reference questions," but turning it so that it's not a negative answer. So they're still having a positive experience, even though they're not being particularly positive themselves.
I'm not sure about my topic. What do you think I should do? Get a lot of inquiries on Ask a Librarian about people needing help with their homework and needing advice. And so, how do you handle these type of inquiries in an emotionally intelligent way?
First of all, what emotion do you think they're feeling? Confusion, yeah. And then the same person who said confusion said maybe you could just ask what are your interests, what are the guidelines for the assessment, for the assignment. So asking them, um, giving them concrete places they can go, right? Uncertainty, they might be feeling anxiety, and they might be feeling intimidated, exactly. So we can't just, so you might like take it at face value and say, I'm not doing your work for you, but maybe they're feeling intimidated. And now's the time to really talk to them and say, okay, well, sometimes it just works to go with something that's interesting to you. Overwhelmed, exactly. So there's all these emotions that are coming just from this one sentence. And it's when we're more emotionally intelligent, it can help us to come at that question in a way that's going to be more positive for the patron. And then someone said, we can say, let's talk you through it. Exactly. Saying, look, I'm here for you. I have the time for you because you might be feeling overwhelmed.
Mhm. Exactly.
I love it, guys.
Great responses. So, rethinking best practices. These are best practices we established for our team, but I wanted to include them in this presentation because we really sort of thought about these best practices based on emotional intelligence and how we could increase that. So our number one thing is use less canned chats. One thing about canned chats is we're constantly trying to tell people we're not robots, we're real people, but canned chats sometimes can make us sound like robots. I use canned chats, especially when I'm doing my grading and when I'm doing my sign off or sometimes with problem patrons. But more and more, I've tried to actually use less canned chats. I try to give people a personalized grading. I try and ask my own unique follow-up questions because I want to put my personality, put my emotions out there too, and let people know I'm positive, I'm happy, I'm excited to help you. Let's get through this together.
And I want to
Let's
mention,
Yeah.
I want to mention that for those of you who are in Florida and use Ask a Librarian and use the Live Answer software, you can make your own canned chats within there. And if you do that, at least the canned chats will have your same kind of voice, right? Rather than the voice of someone else.
Exactly. And listening and empathy. These are two huge things that I'm always going to put through to our team and to people staffing Ask Librarian. Make sure you're actively listening and make sure that you are showing empathy to our patrons, whether that is in person, but especially on virtual reference, and making sure you're always communicating these two things even in a virtual environment. We try and pick up questions in 25 seconds or less. Try is, of course, what we do because that's not always possible. But there's research that says when people are waiting longer than 30 seconds, they start to get a little frustrated or feel a little annoyed. So a lot of times, if you pick up questions very quickly, people are going to start out and feel happy and excited. Take patrons from where they've been searching the known to better sources, which is the unknown. So what we really try to do in virtual reference is think about teaching moments. And you don't want to if they're a brand new person who is unfamiliar with the library, you don't want to get them super right, just send them a link to the catalog or something like that. You really need to take patrons on a path of like learning and discovery and think about where they're coming from and then how can you improve their search or their sources or help them find what they're looking for. And my last rethink of best practice is to get to know your patron, especially in terms of searching expertise. So even though we're working in an academic environment at a university, brand new freshmen are very different in their skill set than our graduate students and our faculty. And so making sure we ask, hey, have you ever used a library database before? Have you ever been to the library before? Because they're coming from very different places and this is going to affect their cognitive abilities and their emotion to feel and their feelings toward the library. If you try and just throw them in to something really difficult, they're going to feel overwhelmed and they're not going to get that help that they need.
And so now I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about implementing a VR training program that includes emotional intelligence. And so we'll tell you a little bit about some of the things Lindsay and I have done and then talk about some things that might work for you as well. Lindsay and I did a flipped classroom to do training for emotional intelligence in VR. And what we did is we sent out a list of articles, as well as book chapters, as well as some videos. So people could learn the way that works best for them, but all of them were about emotional intelligence. I'm not going to lie, this was actually a lot of work because we had to go through all of those resources that we provided and make sure that they were really very good. But if you get it set up, once you've got that going, it shouldn't be too bad. And that way, we already had people coming into the training knowing about emotional intelligence, knowing about virtual reference. And so what we did is we asked people to read or watch something about emotional intelligence and then read or watch something about virtual reference. And then think about how you could connect them. And I would say I think that flipped classroom model worked pretty well. What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, it was really nice because people were coming in with a basic understanding of emotional intelligence, and that allowed us a lot more time for discussion and engagement on the topic.
And I would also say that people were much more interested in watching the videos than we thought they would be. We thought people would rather read. I think that's just because that's me and Lindsay's learning style, but most people watched the videos because that's what they felt like they had time for. So be aware of that if you are doing it. I don't know about your library system, but our library system has some really great video databases that we could kind of check through to find some emotional intelligence stuff. We actually provided in-person and online training for this service. Lindsay is located remotely from Florida State University, but she did come in for some other stuff, and so we were able to do an in-person. And again, this is different people's learning styles. And so we were trying, while we were talking about emotional intelligence, we were trying to come at it in a way that would be comfortable for other people. And I think some people like the online and some people really prefer the in-person. So it was nice to offer both. The positive thing about doing online is then we could record it and put it up, which we did, so that we can then move the training forward for people as we get more people who are doing virtual reference. Then you also want to think about your assessment when you're doing training for emotional intelligence. When you're doing any training, of course, you want to think about assessment. But the assessment for emotional intelligence, that can be a little bit more difficult because, like we said, it's kind of a qualitative thing, not a quantitative thing. And so I think a really good way to assess how the training went is to go back to your practitioners later and say, do you feel like this was helpful to you? Did you think about the emotional intelligence at all? It can be a very it doesn't have to be like a survey or anything like that. It can just be a couple of questions. Hey, do you feel like this was helpful? Are you still using it? Do you feel like you could use some more emotional intelligence training? But just keeping up with it. You don't want to just do a training and then you're done with the training. If you do a training, you probably put a lot of time and effort into it, and so you do want to go forward and make sure that it's still working for the people who you did that training with. And then the last thing I want to say is virtual reference requires a multi-layered skill set, which is what it's supposed to say and not skillet. But that includes reference. And so doing that reference interview, knowing the resources that your library has. It includes technology, which is how to walk someone through a technology problem, how to use the technology yourself, how to use technology to teach better, like maybe you're using Jing or something like that to do screenshots. It includes customer service because sometimes we're the only point of customer service. The only point that that patron's gonna talk to the library is through Ask a Librarian. And then it includes communication. And that's where the emotional intelligence really hits in. Because if you can't communicate well, then your reference isn't going to do a whole lot of good. And your customer service won't be understood because you're not communicating in a way that works for the patron. So virtual reference training is not just here's how to use the software, go do it. Virtual reference training is something that should be continual. Virtual reference training is something that you need to think about on a lot of different levels. Did anyone have any questions about that before we move on? Great. We have more time for questions later too, so if you do have any, just let us know.
Great, so we are at our time of final discussion, and my favorite picture of the presentation. So as our numbers continue to rise, we really need to improve our service and support the diverse needs of our patrons. And we started out talking about how we have this major increase in our chat, and that's when me and Emily were like, we gotta do more training. We got to keep continually training, keep thinking of innovative strategies to meet our patrons at the time of need. And so that's really where we came from with this emotional intelligence training and always trying to improve our service. I really believe that chat reference is going to continue to rise in popularity with our patrons. People just love being able to ask a librarian something really quick like that. And so I don't think it's going anywhere. And it's something that we need to think, how can we continue to be better at this service? I mean, it's all about libraries, relevance, and our importance to our communities. And I think that this is an aspect of it that, really can't be ignored. And so it's about recognizing and enhancing your emotional intelligence. Generally, this is going to obviously support you in your in-person reference interactions as well as what you're doing in the virtual environment. So thinking about emotional intelligence, thinking about how you can use that to improve your chat, and you know who we are as librarians and library staff. And always practicing empathy. I think there's really something important about that. Patrons are choosing to come to Ask a Librarian instead of going to Google. They're making a choice to talk to a real person, and they want to have a real person, an interaction where they feel the empathy and they feel like they're having a real conversation with somebody. So think about that and think about what role we play there and why, that person is coming to you and hoping that they can find someone who will understand what they need and, really help them be successful in finding what they need. And yeah, because we're awesome at navigating through Google. We are the Google guides. So that is the end of our presentation. We do have a slide of works cited because we're good librarians and we would not go without it. And there is time for questions. I believe we have a little less than 10 minutes. And I put Emily and I's email down there. We would love to hear your thoughts about emotional intelligence, virtual reference training. So feel free to contact us. But now is the time for questions. So we'd be excited to hear your thoughts or your questions.
All right, so someone wrote, who runs Ask a Librarian and who thought of it? I think Ask a Librarian is run through 2BLC. I don't know who thought of it.
Vicky would almost be a better person to answer that question, but it is it's funded by the Tampa Bay Library Consortium. But library chat has been around for a long time. So there's chats and national chat service and all sorts of library chats, but I would be interested in finding what's the first library chat. And no, thank you. Thank everyone for coming today.